Yes. So, I think I can't really fully talk about this without giving a little bit of personal background. I was trying to make this more exclusively on Southeast Asia and what I was reporting on at the time, but those are very much tied up to feelings of emotion and sometimes a bit of harsh memories to look back on. So, just for general context, I was at the time sort of finishing up a master's degree in Asian studies at Leiden University, but I was spent the beginning of 2020 doing the work. I was working for BBC Monitoring at the time, basically doing media monitoring in Indonesian and Malay and English. And well, the Indonesian and the Malay side of things, I was translating back into English. So I ended up going from Indonesia to Malaysia in the beginning of March 2020 because of a political crisis that was happening in Malaysia at the time and trying to get a uh, grounded perspective of what was happening. And well, then, like many people, I got stuck there and feasibly had no way to go, had no way of getting back into the Netherlands because as someone who holds the United States passport, they had banned all US passports, and I was unsure. I was supposed to be allowed back in with my residence permit, but that's quite a frightful thing to just go pay all these money for flights during a pandemic, and it's very much up to the discretion of the Border Patrol office if they're going to let you in or not. And that might depend a bit on how they were feeling that day. So I was basically stuck in, once the lockdown came about in Malaysia, I was stuck in a city called Kota Kinabalu where I knew absolutely no one. I was completely by myself, and it was not the best, not exactly the best experience to have during lockdown. So, just with kind of a grain of salt going into all of this, this isn't going to be the perfect, all encompassing presentation on COVID in Southeast Asia. It will be coded a bit by my own experiences and thoughts, and I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm going to try and hit some of the highlights that I think are perhaps important to talk about, just to kind of give an overview of what things were like there. And as well, if anyone has a question at any point of time, feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer anything, and this is a little bit informal. I tried to put together in a more standardized formal talk for this, and for the past few weeks, it's been a bit of a struggle given how much of an emotionally charged topic this can be to present on. Um, but without further ado, I think we can get on to the next slide, the first picture that there is there. Um, so happy news, first of all. We've just had Eid al-Fitr, and this is the first time in 3 years that a lot of Indonesians have been able to travel back to their home villages. In Indonesia, as well as Malaysia to an extent, it is usually people only have a chance to go home if they work in the cities. They only get to go back to their hometowns once a year for a few weeks for the Eid holidays. It's a big thing. It's referred to as mudik, pulang kampung, or in Malaysia, balik kampung, return to the village. And that was put on hold for 2 years. So this is the first time, thankfully, given the state of things, it's improved so much. 85 million Indonesians are expected to travel back to their hometowns. Well, most of them will currently be there and probably be heading back to the major cities like Jakarta in the coming days. But that's kind of a landmark. And also, just to put into perspective, because vaccine equity came up quite a bit with regards to Southeast Asia, but very high rates of vaccines currently. Singapore, 88%, Malaysia, nearly 85%, and Indonesia at 72%, which is fairly remarkable given how large Indonesia is, how geographically diverse it is, and also how economically diverse it is. And for perspective, the global rates are roughly 60%, and the UK is about 78%, the EU around 75%. So there were delays to it with rollouts, but overall, the things have improved, and they're showing good signs. So I suppose we can go on to the next slide then. Right. So this was pretty monumental, right? I'll just go down kind of a little bit of how the pandemic started in Southeast Asia. Singapore and Malaysia both saw detected cases in January, but they were largely limited communities, and they were controlled fairly well by strong measures that were in place early on, not lockdown measures, but just the encouraging of face masks, social distancing, and testing. But things really did start to escalate in March. At the end of February, there was a very large religious gathering in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, that was attended by thousands of people who flew in internationally, and unsurprisingly, over the case of about a week or two, cases in Malaysia rose from under 30 to over 3,000, which triggered the lockdown that was announced on the 16th of March and began on the 18th of March. Just a comment about the Malaysian lockdown, just I suppose to compare it to what we might know a bit more about the British perspective of, right, you were still able to go out for exercise once a day. It was very different in Malaysia, where there were police barricades right outside of my flat. They were strictly monitoring where you were going and for how long. You were only supposed to leave the house in order to go to hospital or to purchase food. And if they kind of saw you leave your house too much to buy food, they would start questioning you. Which is a bit different to kind of be really trapped in a place. You can't even go outside for exercise. You can't go outside for a walk. You are just trapped into your four walls for it was about 2.5 months where I was located. Then Indonesia, on the other hand, it first started to announce travel restrictions on different countries in February. First, mainland China in the beginning of February, and then South Korea, Italy, and Iran in the beginning of March. The first COVID case was detected in Indonesia in the beginning of March, and there's also prompted some, I think, interesting privacy debates, since certain information about the case zero was leaked, and a lot of that information was wrong and ended up being a bit defamatory against the person, which I think was a debate that was sort of happening in a lot of places at the time. How do we kind of find a way between contact tracing and then between violating someone's privacy. But then as the month went on, more and more cases, it was thought that COVID probably was in Indonesia at a much earlier date, but just that it did not have the ability to detect it like a lot of other countries had. So there was unlike Singapore and Malaysia, which had nationalized lockdowns, the lockdowns were on a local basis in Indonesia instead. So there is a bit of a difference between the urban perspective and the rural perspective, I suppose. But just back to this photo that I have up, the Singapore and Malaysia land border, it is one of the busiest, if not the busiest, land borders in the world. Prior to the pandemic, more than 300,000 people would travel back and forth between the two countries each day for work, because Singapore, you earn much higher wages in Singapore. Malaysia has much cheaper accommodation and housing prices. A lot of people who lived in Johor Bahru would send their children over to school in Singapore. And that all had to come to a very dramatic halt. And it, especially with Singapore being this very international business commerce focused city, to have to kind of cut itself off was pretty noteworthy. We can go on to the next slide, I suppose. So this was just what I'd mentioned of the police barricades, which is, I don't think, something that you would have seen here. And I had something similar, although I lived off of in a much smaller compound than this giant military that we're looking at now. But you would see the police would stop everyone and they would ask, where are you going? Do you have the permission to be there? And naturally, a lot of if someone who was famous was caught kind of violating this, that went viral, and there was a lot of just very opinionated speech that was going on in social media in Malaysia anytime that someone would sort of do anything that would be considered to violating the very strict notion of what lockdown would be. Including, I think a very notable case to bring up here was a doctor who I believe was in his 50s or 60s, a cardiologist, who was trying during the lockdown to go for a run at a park to get some exercise. And he received an incredible, when his case was publicized, he was arguing that, well, we need physical exercise at this time in order to keep up our physical health so we don't fall ill to COVID, and in many other countries, they are able to go out and get physical exercise. And he received a lot of really negative feedback online. I think in the trope that we're probably quite common to hearing at this point, but it was especially common early on in the pandemic of, oh, like, don't you think about your grandmother or some elderly person, you're killing the elderly. And it was a very emotional event that went on. I even witnessed some children who lived in the same block of flats that I did went outside to go and kick the football around with each other, and their mother was told to make them go back inside by the police. They weren't interacting with anyone from a different household, but it was, at least in the cities, very focused on the optics of following the rules, as well as what you were actually doing. Now, there were a lot of people who weren't strictly following the rules, of course, but they had to be extremely covert about it. There was also a very big difference when I talked to people who lived in rural parts of the country where there just might not have even been any knowledge about the degree to which what was actually going on, and a lot of people just kind of went about their lives as usual. But since COVID wasn't in the area to begin with, it didn't end up really being that big of a problem. So we can go on to the next photo. And much like what I think we've seen in most of the world, there were government aid programs, but these also brought up some scrutiny in and of themselves. Here was the government aid, government like food distribution of basic goods, including things like rice, cooking oil, sardines, canned veg, noodles, few other household basics that was distributed to poor families in Indonesia with a value of about 300,000 Indonesian rupiah, which equals about £15, but that means considerably more in Indonesia. It does buy you a lot more. However, so the main part of this program, instead of sort of doing just immediate cash transfers, which is also difficult because you have a lot of people who might not be in the banking system, and a lot of the most affected would be people who work in the informal economy, who don't have a sort of state sponsored, state known about job. It's the people who kind of go and they sell things outside of the offices, food, other wares. They have small businesses. They're very reliant on people kind of being very active in the cities in order to sell things, and these were the people who were most affected. So they thought, okay, well, we'll go and deliver food aid, and we'll also use all of the sorry, I should have explained this a bit better. But in Indonesia, a very common way of getting around is through motorcycle taxis, especially considering how public transportation is still rather limited in a lot of Indonesian cities. So the people who, the motorcycle taxis, they were very much out of jobs as well, because unless they were doing food deliveries, they were not driving people back and forth from the office, from the train station, from the bus stop, and so forth. So the government thought, oh, okay, well, we'll just go and employ them to go and deliver all these food parcels to needy families. And we'll do this. We'll do one in April, we'll do one in May, we'll do one in June. And of course, it was found out, unfortunately, that there was a lot of corruption that went behind this program, which outraged a number of people. In Malaysia as well, they had programs. People are a little bit more within the banking system there, so it was easier, but there's still problems with rural outreach, which if we could just go to the next slide. So another example is, as we were all transitioning to this work from home situation, that's affecting different people in different ways. Not everyone had access to a computer or even their own smartphone. A lot of times it would be, especially in the rural and poor areas, everyone in the house was crowding around the parents' one smartphone that they would try and do all their lessons at home from while school was cancelled. Now, there were in all of these countries, there were programs to help people get access to devices that would allow them to continue their education. And they did put educational programs on terrestrial television, since that has a much wider reach than computers might have. But even in instances where someone might get the access to these devices, the technology hasn't been built up the same way, and you have places that don't have access to the internet. And this was also a very interesting case. A university student who, at home, when she was studying for her exams, she took her exams up in a tree, because that's where she was able to actually get a decent cellular reception. And it also shows a bit of the rural urban divide in Malaysia, as well as the eastern western divide, because people in the very much more developed urban parts of Western Malaysia went, oh no, this couldn't possibly be the case. This student, she's lying, she's making things up, she's trying to get pity. Look, now the BBC's covering her, and all of these things. When, you know, in reality, it's a lot more difficult to sit your university exams when you're up in a tree trying to complete them, and you're worrying about, oh no, is the phone battery going to die, than if you're sat down comfortably at a desk. but it has pushed for more development in the rural areas, although it's sadly the case that I think students everywhere, their progress might have been slowed down due to the pandemic, but it's especially felt much more strongly in the rural communities and in those that are poor. And we can go on to the next photo now. So just kind of a day-to-day perspective, this was a very common sight. This is a Singaporean hawker center. Lots of people rely on these for food. It's tasty and it's cheap, and they're usually on the ground floor of most housing estates, as well as out in the urban areas. But you would just see all of these seating areas would be blocked off, even after the strictest sense of the lockdown started to be lifted. You still had people, very strict of how many people could sit where. It was much more monitored. And these sort of tapes and these visual reminders of the time that you would be in. We can also go to the next slide after this. And so this is an example from Malaysia that I was quite common with seeing of every time you entered a place, you had to have your temperature taken and you had to check in with a government app, specifying your temperature, your phone number, all of these details, to the point where it actually got to be a bit difficult to go around if you didn't have a smartphone. So some people had to actually go out and buy smartphones or else they couldn't get into shops. And I think to an extent, we're familiar with contact tracing happening in a lot of restaurant sort of establishments, but just think of every single shop that you went into, you had to go and have your temperature checked, you had to go and sign in, although a lot of it was a little bit of a performance theater, because I remember multiple times the temperature guns that they used would be way off. They would sort of give you a reading of, oh, well, your temperature is 31 degrees. I don't think that my temperature could have possibly have been 31 degrees, or else that would have been a bit of a problem. And I would try and bring this up, and they said, no, it's fine. As long as you're under like 37 degrees, then you don't have to worry. You can come in, no problem. And then sometimes you would also use them and they would say that your temperature was 45 degrees because it's a tropical climate and the temperature had been sat out in the sun all day long. But these things, they very much became a normal part of life. Malaysia, as of Monday, I believe, has just gotten rid of the requirement to do temperature checks and track and trace everywhere you go. So it is very much a sign that things are getting back to normal. But still, it was kind of easy how quickly you fell into accepting this as the normal, to the extent that when I came to Scotland in September 2020 and I didn't see these things anymore, I was a bit shocked. As well as with mask wearing, I'll just touch on that very quickly. That was, you didn't see resistance to it really. If anything, there were maybe some issues just because of availability and of pricing, but once the market worked out and governments were sending out masks to people's homes to make sure that there were adequate supplies, people weren't very resistant to it. But there were much stricter rules about it. Like you couldn't walk, even once the strictest sense of the lockdown was lifted in Malaysia, you still couldn't go for a walk outside without a mask. You had to wear a mask when you were running. And if you didn't, you would be fined. And there was one time I was riding my bike and decided to take the mask off, and I was pulled over by a police officer saying, no, you need to use your mask when you're riding a bike. I climbed a mountain and I had to wear the mask when I was climbing the mountain. Although a lot of people took it off by that point, but that was still, you got like a bit scared into the rules. I was very much scared by the rules because of what was going on in journalism at the time. And we can just, we can go to the next slide now. So this is just a still from a a documentary by Al Jazeera, which was on the migrant community, the migrant workers in Malaysia, who essentially, because they live in such close quarters and worked under poor conditions, cases started spreading amongst migrant workers very quickly, and the government ended up basically locking them into compounds and sort of detaining them almost like prisoners in very small spaces where it was very much easy for COVID to spread amongst them. And they were also doing checks and detaining anyone who didn't have proper documentation. This was also something that was very different from the way that they treated expats versus the way that they treated migrants. Anyone who's of the migrant worker population who it did not have a valid work visa at the time, even though they might have previously had a valid working visa, but it had lapsed, and it's difficult to get those renewed. They're often based off of workplaces, and sometimes the workplaces are just trying to get as cheap of labor as possible, and they're not taking care of this. So they were very much stuck, and they couldn't afford to go back to where they were from. They were stuck and basically locked up, and Al Jazeera did a documentary on this. It was treated very harshly by the pro-government internet warriors, and then in turn by the government, who raided the Al Jazeera offices and was saying all of these things about against foreign journalists and how foreign journalists shouldn't be here. And it gets to a point when you are a foreign journalist and you work for a foreign news organization that it does kind of become a little bit scary, even though I was in a very safe position as someone who didn't report on anything controversial, basically just covered what was already being said in the Malaysian media. There's still a sense of fear and a sense of paranoia that goes around with this. And although there wasn't the same crackdown on media, Singapore had a very similar problem with its migrant worker population being stuck in close quarters of, you would have bunk beds and bunk beds and bunk beds, 16 people in a hostel all living together. And once one person catches COVID in an environment like that, it's going to spread very easily, which once again leads to talks about, everyone's perspective in this pandemic was not necessarily the same because we didn't have access to the same spaces. We didn't, some people are living in much closer quarters than others, and some people don't have the opportunity to not be going out to work. But in a kind of, we can go to the next slide now. Turning back to Indonesia and the more positive turn of things. Indonesia had one of the first rollouts of the COVID vaccine, which began with shipments in early January. They primarily were using the Chinese Sinovac COVID vaccine at the time, which did receive some criticism because there was a lot of perception that it wouldn't be as good as it didn't have the same efficacy rates as the AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, and that's a big reason why the Indonesian president went and had a very publicized shoot of him receiving the Sinovac vaccine to encourage people in order to get it, and that it was safe. And there were a lot of delays in the program. It was first, I think, similar to most countries, first for the people who were healthcare workers, then it was for people who had very public-facing jobs, then immunocompromised, and gradually spread elsewhere. But around April, there were significant lags in the program because of what was happening in India, and India deciding to block exports of its vaccine led to massive delays. And we can go to the next photo now, which was the very big spike that happened in Indonesia by July. It was associated with delays in vaccine rollout, as well as just the fact that the Sinovac vaccine, which they were mostly reliant on at this time, had a lower efficacy rate as Moderna and Pfizer, which also the mRNA vaccines did pose additional problems in a place that has parts of it that are significantly less developed, where it's hard to get something to have the temperatures that are low enough to really to really allow for that to be shipped out there. Um, but this and there were people at this time who were lining up outside of massive health centers demanding vaccinations, and it was kind of at the same time that you were hearing in other countries people refusing to get vaccinated, which was a little bit frustrating to be reporting on this and then constantly hearing in the news, you know, countries with large surpluses of the COVID vaccine at the time, like the United States, and people refusing to get it. And then you see people who are very desperate to get it. But following that, there were significant amounts of vaccines sent over, and they have achieved very strong progress in vaccination, and there's never quite been a spike that was quite as bad as this. And you can just go on to the next photo. Oh, sorry, just one more quick note that I did want to add to that was that another issue at this time that was seen throughout the pandemic, but very exacerbated at this particular point, was that the cities in Indonesia were really running out of graves in which they could actually bury people. So they did have to rely on mass graves, or kind of stacking the bodies on top of each other. Less so at this time, but more so in the beginning of the pandemic. There were also concerns with certain cemeteries did not want to accept bodies of people who had tested positive for COVID because they were afraid that it would lead to outbreaks there as well. So that was another issue to kind of have to go work with, and that's why people who were handling bodies in this way were usually wearing so much PPE. But then we can go on just to the final slide. So, as I had perhaps mentioned in the beginning, part of the reason why I was in Malaysia at the time when COVID was becoming serious worldwide was because of the political crisis that was going on. And that also strongly impacted how Malaysia handled the COVID pandemic and how it was perceived by its people. So a little bit of background for Malaysian political history. This might ring a bell because it's received a lot of coverage internationally, but in the 2000s, Prime Minister at the time, Najib Razak, had been accused of heavy corruption involving billions of dollars that were from state funds that were leaked out into his family and his inner circle. This led to the first change in party in Malaysian political history since its independence, which saw previous Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad becoming Prime Minister again, yet under a different party. But there was still he was supposed to only be temporary prime minister and would release it onto his formal rival, now political ally, Anwar Ibrahim. But that led to a lot of conflicts that was going on, and kind of almost out of nowhere to a lot of people, but it makes sense looking at the way that how chaotic it was, he resigned at the end of February 2020, which was at a time where a lot of Malaysians were criticizing the government for being involved too much in political drama and not enough into dealing with the pandemic. And so he's followed up by Yin Yasin kind of ends up with the position, and a lot of people are opposed to this because they say, well, this isn't what we voted for. And he doesn't have a very positive track record throughout this. So then he gets ousted again, and there's just been a lot of debate about where the future of Malaysian politics will be going with this, and the pandemic sort of slowed this down. At the same time, the pandemic and control measures were used to criticize protesters whenever they came out in Malaysia or in Indonesia. Indonesia notably, and it was supposed to pass in February 2020, but it was delayed until August, passed this very controversial job creation law, which would remove a lot of protections for workers and also lead to a lot of harm in the environment. Um, and that was protested heavily, especially by students. And then the students were in turn criticized because, oh, well, what if they spread COVID with their protesting? And I think a lot of the world saw some pretty significant protesting throughout the pandemic, but it was of a different kind of variety that you were seeing over there, and much more to do with government corruption and domestic issues. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to check my notes real quick to see if there was anything else that was major that I wanted to cover. I guess just to touch a little bit more about journalism and the media and the kind of struggles to be able to properly criticize the government during this. There were notably a number of newspapers and media outlets shut down or very struggled to survive it. But alternatively, there was some interest with how many young people joined TikTok, and I think that that was seen pretty globally, and it was used to communicate a lot about the protests that were going on. I saw a lot of this in Indonesia, which interestingly, the Indonesian government does try and crack down and arrest or interrogate people based off of their social media post, but because of the nature of TikTok, it wasn't really able to figure out that algorithm at the time. I'm not sure, perhaps they have since, but there was a lot, since it was a newer platform, they didn't really understand it. That's how a lot of information about the student protests related to the job creation bill was being spread.